What if this was India today?
What if the greatest empire the world never saw had been allowed to flourish? Imagine a timeline where the ships that changed everything, those wooden vessels carrying ambition and gunpowder across impossible oceans, never found their foothold. Where the East India Company's clerks and merchants were turned away not by armies, but by something far more powerful: unity, vision, and the simple refusal to be divided. In our world, the story of India is inseparable from the story of its colonization. 300 years of subjugation, $45 trillion extracted, famines engineered, languages suppressed, borders drawn by men who had never walked the lands they were carving apart. But what if it had gone differently? What if, in 1615, when Sir Thomas Roe arrived at the court of Emperor Jahangir seeking trade privileges, he had been met not with curiosity and gradual concession, but with calculated refusal? What if the Mughal Empire, instead of fragmenting under its own weight and European pressure, had modernized, consolidated, and evolved into something the world had never seen before? This is not a story of fantasy. This is a story of paths not taken, of decisions that could have been made differently, of a world where the Indian subcontinent never became a colony, but instead became a civilization that would reshape global power, technology, and philosophy for centuries to come. This is the story of how the absence of empire created an empire of a different kind entirely. Historical context: what actually happened? Visual: a sweeping map of 17th century India showing the vast Mughal Empire stretching from Afghanistan to Bengal, its territories marked in deep gold and crimson. To understand what we lost, or perhaps what we gained, we must first understand what truly happened. In 1600, the British East India Company was chartered. It was not a government. It was a corporation, a trading company with shareholders and profit margins, and ambitious men who saw the wealth of India, its textiles, its spices, its unimaginable riches, and wanted a share. At the time, India was not a single nation. It was a subcontinent of kingdoms, sultanates, and the mighty Mughal Empire, which controlled most of the north. The Mughals were sophisticated, wealthy beyond European comprehension, and militarily formidable. Their court was a center of art, science, and culture. Their GDP represented nearly a quarter of the world's total economy. But the Mughals had a weakness. They were not interested in naval power. They were a land-based empire, and the seas meant little to them. The British exploited this. They didn't conquer India with armies, not at first. They came as traders. They asked for small permissions, a warehouse here, a trading post there, and slowly, over decades, they played regional powers against each other. They bribed, manipulated, and waited for the Mughal Empire to weaken from within. By the mid-1700s, the Mughal Empire was fracturing. Regional governors declared independence. Hindu and Muslim kingdoms warred with each other. The Marathas rose in the west, the Sikhs in the north. Chaos bred opportunity. And the British East India Company, no longer just a company, but a private army with its own massive military force, stepped into the vacuum. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 was the beginning of the end. A small British force, led by Robert Clive, defeated the Nawab of Bengal through treachery and bribery. It wasn't a military victory. It was a corporate takeover. From there, the dominoes fell. By 1857, the British controlled most of India. The Sepoy Mutiny, what Indians called the First War of Independence, was brutally crushed. The British Crown took direct control, and India became the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. For the next 90 years, India was bled dry. Its industries were dismantled to benefit British manufacturers. Its farmers were forced to grow cash crops instead of food, leading to famines that killed tens of millions. Its wealth flowed to London, building railways and museums and imperial glory on the backs of starvation and subjugation. India gained independence in 1947, but it was partitioned, torn apart into India and Pakistan, in a process so violent, so rushed, that over 1 million people died in the communal riots that followed. That is what happened. But what if the very first step, the East India Company's foothold, had never been granted?
The point of divergence, 1615, the refusal. The year is 1615. Sir Thomas Roe, England's ambassador, arrives at the Mughal court in Agra. He carries letters from King James I and gifts meant to impress: paintings, English textiles, novelties. Emperor Jahangir, fourth ruler of the Mughal dynasty, is a man of culture and curiosity. He's fascinated by art, by poetry, by the strange customs of foreigners. In our timeline, he grants Roe modest trading rights. Nothing significant, just enough to get a foot in the door. But in this timeline, something is different. Jahangir's chief advisor, a brilliant Persian scholar named Ihmad-ud-Dawla, has been studying reports from the Portuguese settlements in Goa. He has seen what happens when European trading companies are allowed to establish permanent bases. He has watched the Portuguese fortify their positions, turn trade monopolies into military strongholds, play local rulers against each other. He advises caution. More than that, he advises refusal. "Your Majesty," he says, "these men do not come as mere merchants. They come with ships that carry cannons. They come with charters that give them the authority to wage war in the name of commerce. If we allow them even the smallest permanent settlement, we grant them a position from which they can never be fully removed." Jahangir listens. He respects Ihmad-ud-Dawla, and crucially, he is at the height of his power. The Mughal Empire is stable, wealthy, militarily dominant. He does not need British trade. India's textiles are already the most sought after in the world. Its spices, its craftsmanship, all of it flows outward naturally through established networks. So Jahangir makes a decision. He allows the British to trade, but only through intermediaries. No permanent settlements, no fortifications, no land grants. They may come to Indian ports, conduct their business, and leave. If they want more, they must prove themselves useful to the empire, not as armed merchants, but as genuine partners in knowledge, technology, or diplomacy. Sir Thomas Roe returns to England with little to show for his efforts. The East India Company's investors are disappointed. Some of their capital shifts to other ventures: the Americas, the Caribbean, the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. India remains, for now, beyond their reach. And that single decision, that single refusal, changes everything. The alternate timeline begins 1615 to 1700, the Mughal Renaissance. Without the slow poison of European manipulation, the Mughal Empire does not fragment as it did in our timeline. Jahangir's successor, Shah Jahan, the emperor who built the Taj Mahal, recognizes that the world is changing. European powers are expanding globally. If India is to remain sovereign, it cannot simply rely on its land-based military dominance. It must control the seas. Shah Jahan initiates what will later be called the Great Maritime Reforms. He establishes imperial shipyards in Surat, Calicut, and the Bengal coast. He recruits shipbuilders from the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and even renegade Portuguese engineers. The Mughal navy begins to take shape, not as a raiding force, but as a defensive and commercial fleet capable of protecting Indian trade routes from European interference.
Indian merchants, no longer undercut by European monopolies, flourish. The textile trade expands. Indian cotton and silk become even more dominant in global markets. Wealth flows into the empire, and with it, stability. But Shah Jahan's son, Aurangzeb, presents a problem. In our timeline, Aurangzeb's rigid orthodox rule alienated large portions of the empire, particularly the Hindu Rajputs and the rising Maratha power. His endless military campaigns drained the treasury and sowed the seeds of rebellion. In this timeline, Aurangzeb still comes to power, but the absence of European meddling has a subtle, profound effect. There are no foreign powers offering weapons and alliances to disaffected regional leaders, no British agents whispering promises of support to rebels. Aurangzeb's campaigns are still brutal. His orthodoxy still alienates, but the fractures do not become chasms. The empire bends, but does not break. When Aurangzeb dies in 1707, the Mughal Empire is weaker than it was, but it is not collapsing. Regional powers like the Marathas and the Sikhs are strong, yes, but they are not at war with a fragmenting center. Instead, a complex balance of power emerges. The Mughals retain symbolic and administrative authority over much of the north. The Marathas dominate the Deccan. The Sikhs control Punjab. The Rajputs hold Rajasthan. And crucially, they begin to see themselves not as rivals for a dying empire's corpse, but as regional powers within a shared civilizational space. Because without European powers to play them against each other, the cost of endless internal war becomes unbearable. By 1750, something unprecedented begins to take shape: a loose Indian confederation. Not a single unified state, but a network of kingdoms and empires bound by trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, and shared cultural identity. It's messy, it's fractious, but it works. And it's strong enough to keep Europe at arm's length. 1750 to 1800. The age of Indian diplomacy. The mid-18th century is when European colonialism reaches its zenith. The British, French, Dutch, and Portuguese are all vying for control of global trade. In our timeline, this is when India falls. In this timeline, India does not fall because it learns to play the European powers against each other with the same ruthlessness they once used against Indian kingdoms. The Marathas, now the dominant military power in Western India, are pragmatic. They understand that European technology, particularly in firearms, shipbuilding, and metallurgy, is advancing rapidly. So they invite European engineers and gunsmiths to work for them, not as colonizers, as employees. The Mughals do the same in the north. The Sikhs in Punjab adopt European military drilling techniques. Indian courts begin to modernize their armies not through subjugation, but through selective adoption. Meanwhile, Indian merchants grow wealthy trading with Europe on their own terms. Indian textiles still dominate global markets. Indian dyes, indigo, and spices are in high demand. But now the profits stay in India. The British try, repeatedly, to gain a stronger foothold. They offer military alliances, they seek permissions for fortified settlements, they play regional powers against each other. But every time, they are outmaneuvered. The Maratha diplomat Nana Fadnavis becomes a legendary figure, a master of realpolitik who keeps the British, French, and Portuguese in a state of constant competition, ensuring none can dominate. He grants trade concessions to all of them, but never exclusive ones. He allows limited European military advisors, but never their own armies on Indian soil. By 1800, India is not a colony, it is a complex, evolving civilization, fractious, yes, but independent. Its economy is booming, its regional powers are modernizing, and crucially, it is beginning to develop a shared political consciousness. The idea begins to spread. India, despite its many kingdoms and religions, is a civilizational unit, not a nation in the European sense, but something older, deeper, a shared identity that transcends borders. 1800 to 1850, the Indian Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution begins in Britain in the late 18th century. In our timeline, Britain used its colonial dominance over India to destroy Indian industry, forcing India to export raw materials and import British finished goods, effectively deindustrializing the subcontinent. In this timeline, the opposite happens. Indian merchants and regional governments, seeing the wealth being generated by European industrialization, begin to import the technology themselves. British and European engineers are hired, at great expense, to build factories in Bengal, Gujarat, and the Deccan. But the Indians do not simply copy, they adapt. Indian textile manufacturing, already the most sophisticated in the world, integrates mechanization rapidly. Indian cotton mills begin producing fabric at industrial scale, and because Indian labor is skilled and abundant, they undercut British prices in global markets. The economic consequences are enormous. In our timeline, Britain's industrial wealth was built in part on the destruction of Indian industry. In this timeline, India competes. British textile manufacturers, facing fierce competition from Indian mechanized production, lobbied their government for protectionist tariffs. This begins a trade war. Britain imposes heavy tariffs on Indian goods. In response, the Indian Confederation, now a loose but increasingly coordinated network of kingdoms, imposes counter-tariffs on British imports. The British economy suffers, not catastrophically, but significantly. India remains one of the world's largest markets, and losing access to it hurts. Meanwhile, India's industrial base grows. Railways begin to be constructed, not by British companies extracting profit, but by Indian governments and private investors building infrastructure for their own economic development. Indian engineers study European designs and improve them. Indian metallurgy advances. Indian shipbuilding becomes competitive with European yards. By 1850, India is not colonized, it is industrializing, and the world is beginning to take notice. 1850 to 1900, the rise of pan-Indian identity. The mid-19th century is when the concept of the modern nation-state solidifies in Europe. Italy unifies. Germany unifies. Nationalism becomes the dominant political ideology. India, watching this, begins its own transformation. The loose confederation of regional powers that has kept India independent begins to formalize. Leaders from the Maratha Confederacy, the Mughal court, Sikh kingdoms, and southern states begin regular diplomatic summits. They recognize a truth. If they remain fractured, they remain vulnerable. Not to direct conquest, that ship has sailed, but to economic exploitation, to being carved into spheres of influence, to being played against each other by rising global powers. So they begin to construct something unprecedented, a federal Indian Union. It is not easy. There are deep disagreements. Religious tensions between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs remain. Linguistic differences are vast. Regional pride is fierce. But the threat of European imperialism, seeing what has happened to China, to Africa, to the Americas, creates a unifying fear. In 1857, the same year that the Sepoy Mutiny would have occurred in our timeline, something very different happens in this one. The Delhi Convention. Representatives from across the subcontinent gather in Delhi, Mughal nobles, Maratha Peshwas, Sikh Sargars, Southern Rajas, Bengali Zamindars, and they sign a historic document, the Confederal Charter of India. It is not a full political union. Each region retains significant autonomy, but it establishes a unified trade policy toward foreign powers, a coordinated defense pact, a shared currency and banking system, and a confederal council to mediate disputes and coordinate policy. Most importantly, it establishes the principle that India, despite its diversity, is a single civilizational entity with shared interests. The British are horrified. In our timeline, 1857 was when they crushed Indian independence. In this timeline, 1857 is when Indian unity is born. 1900 to 1947. India as a global power. By the turn of the 20th century, India is one of the world's great powers. Its economy is the third largest on Earth, behind only the United States and the combined economies of the British Empire. Its population is vast, its industry growing, its military modernized. When World War I breaks out in 1914, India remains neutral. The European powers beg for Indian support, Britain especially, which in our timeline forcibly conscripted millions of Indian soldiers to fight in European trenches. In this timeline, India watches Europe tear itself apart and refuses to participate. This neutrality is enormously profitable. Indian industry supplies goods to all sides. Indian merchants grow fabulously wealthy. Indian banks finance reconstruction after the war. The interwar period sees India's cultural and intellectual influence grow. Indian philosophy, which had always been profound but was suppressed and exoticized under colonialism, begins to spread globally. Universities in Calcutta, Bombay, and Delhi become centers of learning that rival Oxford and Cambridge. Indian scientists make breakthroughs in mathematics, physics, and medicine, not as individuals working in Western institutions, but as a part of a thriving Indian scientific establishment. When World War II begins, India again remains neutral, but this time it plays a more active role. The Indian Confederal Council condemns fascism and Japanese imperialism. It provides humanitarian aid to China. It offers refuge to Jewish refugees fleeing Europe. And when the war ends and the United Nations is founded, India is one of its founding members, not as a newly independent nation emerging from colonialism, but as a civilization that never lost its sovereignty. By 1947, the year India gained independence in our timeline, India, in this timeline, is celebrating the 50th anniversary of its formalized confederation. It is democratic, federalized, and prosperous. It has not avoided all conflict. There have been internal tensions, regional disputes, occasional violence. But it has never been torn apart by partition. There is no Pakistan, no Bangladesh, no border drawn between Punjab and Bengal by British bureaucrats who had never seen the land they were dividing. India is whole. 1950 to 2000, the Indian century. The second half of the 20th century in our timeline was the American century. The United States emerged from World War II as the world's dominant superpower, spreading its culture, its language, its economic system across the globe. In this timeline, it is a different story. India, having never been colonized, having industrialized on its own terms, having maintained its cultural continuity, becomes one of the world's three superpowers, alongside the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War plays out differently. India, deeply opposed to both imperial capitalism and authoritarian communism, becomes the leader of what it calls the Third Path, a movement of non-aligned nations that refuses to choose between American and Soviet blocs. But India's Third Path is not merely neutrality. It is an alternative vision, a philosophy rooted in Indian traditions of pluralism, federalism, and spiritual pragmatism. Indian economists developed theories of sustainable development that balance growth with environmental stewardship, ideas that, in our timeline, would not emerge until the 21st century. Indian political philosophers articulate models of governance that combine democratic representation with communal consensus building. By the 1970s, India's economy is booming. Its tech sector, centered in Bangalore and Hyderabad, begins to rival Silicon Valley. Indian software engineers are not migrating to America for opportunity. They are building it at home. In 1983, India becomes the third nation to land humans on the moon. The cultural impact is profound. In our timeline, the space race was a symbol of American-Soviet competition. In this timeline, it becomes a symbol of something else. The idea that modernity does not belong exclusively to the West. Indian cinema, already the world's largest film industry, begins to compete globally with Hollywood. Indian music, Indian fashion, Indian cuisine spread not as exotic novelties, but as mainstream culture. By 2000, the world is multilingual in a way it never was in our timeline. English is still important, but so are Hindi, Urdu, Tamil, and Bengali. Indian languages are taught in schools across Asia, Africa, and even parts of Europe. The unipolar American dominance that defined our timeline's late 20th century does not exist. Instead, the world is multipolar, and India is one of the poles. 2000 to 2025, the world we never knew. In our timeline, the 21st century began with American triumphalism. The Cold War was over. Liberal democracy and free market capitalism had won. The end of history was proclaimed. That illusion lasted less than 2 years. September 11, 2001, shattered it. The War on Terror began. The Middle East was plunged into decades of chaos. The 2008 financial crisis revealed the fragility of global capitalism. Populism and authoritarianism surged. Democracy seemed to be in retreat. In this timeline, the story is different, not utopian, but fundamentally altered. Without British colonialism's artificial borders, the Middle East looks different. The Sykes-Picot Agreement never happened. The Ottoman Empire dissolved differently. The arbitrary lines that created so much 20th century conflict were never drawn. India, as a powerful civilizational state that successfully resisted colonialism, becomes a model. Other colonized regions look to India's federal pluralistic system as an alternative to European-imposed nation-states. The Israel-Palestine conflict, in this timeline, plays out differently. The British Mandate never existed in the same form. Jewish refugees after World War II are offered sanctuary in multiple locations, including parts of India, which welcomes them as it has welcomed refugees for millennia. The Kashmir dispute never happens because there was no partition of India, no hasty drawing of borders, no Pakistan created as a separate Muslim state. By 2025, the world is more multipolar, more multilingual, more culturally diverse at the highest levels of power. Climate change is still a crisis. Industrialization happened, regardless of who controlled it, but India's early development of sustainable economic models means the global conversation about climate change looks different. The idea that economic growth must come at the expense of the environment is challenged earlier and more effectively. Technology develops along different lines. Indian contributions to mathematics, computer science, and engineering, which in our timeline often happened in Indian universities, happen in India. Silicon Valley is still important, but so is Bangalore, so is Hyderabad, so is Shenzhen. The internet looks different. It is not dominated by American companies. Instead, it is a truly global network, with Indian, Chinese, European, and American platforms competing and coexisting. Democracy struggles, yes. Authoritarianism rises in some places. But the idea that there is only one model of modernity, the Western model, is thoroughly disproven. India, ancient and modern, spiritual and scientific, diverse and unified, stands as proof that civilizations can modernize without westernizing, that independence is possible, that colonialism was not inevitable. And in this timeline, when people ask, could history have gone differently? The answer is visible every day. It is written in the skyline of Delhi, in the fabric patterns that blend centuries of tradition with cutting-edge design, in the languages spoken in global boardrooms, in the fact that when the world thinks of economic power, of scientific achievement, of cultural influence, it thinks not of a single dominant empire, but of a truly multipolar world where India stands equal with any nation on Earth. Consequences and reflections: what we lost, what we gained. It is tempting to see this alternate timeline as purely better, an India that was never colonized, millions of lives not lost to famines, no partition, no communal violence tearing apart families, no centuries of extraction and humiliation. But history is never simple. In our timeline, the experience of colonialism, brutal as it was, created a shared national identity. The struggle for independence unified a diverse subcontinent. Leaders like Gandhi and Nehru and countless others became symbols of resistance and hope. The very idea of India as a nation, secular, democratic, united despite diversity, was forged in the fires of anti-colonial struggle. In this alternate timeline, that crucible never existed. India's unity is more organic, yes, but also more fragile. The federal confederation is real, but it is not held together by the memory of a common enemy. Regional identities remain stronger. Linguistic nationalism is more pronounced. There is no Mahatma Gandhi in this timeline, at least as we know him. The man who would have become the father of the nation is in this world perhaps a spiritual teacher, perhaps a lawyer, perhaps a philosopher, but not a revolutionary, because there was no empire to revolutionize against. The literature, the art, the music of anti-colonial struggle, Tagore's poems, Bhagat Singh's defiance, the songs of independence, never exist in the same form. And perhaps most profoundly, the Indian diaspora looks completely different. In our timeline, Indians spread across the world, to Britain, to America, to Africa, to Southeast Asia, often as indentured laborers, as refugees, as immigrants seeking opportunity denied in a colonized homeland. In this alternate timeline, Indians who leave do so from a position of strength. They are not fleeing poverty or colonial oppression. They are ambassadors of a powerful civilization. The Indian diaspora is smaller, but more influential. There are also darker possibilities. Without the unifying force of anti-colonial nationalism, communal tensions, Hindu-Muslim relations, caste conflicts might have played out more violently in some periods. The absence of external threat does not automatically create internal harmony. And on the global scale, a world where European colonialism was successfully resisted in India might have led colonial powers to be even more brutal elsewhere, pouring resources into holding Africa, into suppressing independence movements in Southeast Asia, into maintaining control where control was still possible. Every historical divergence creates winners and losers. Every path not taken closes other doors. But what cannot be denied is this. In our timeline, India lost centuries of wealth, of development, of self-determination, $45 trillion extracted, tens of millions dead in engineered famines, languages suppressed, histories rewritten by the conquerors. In this alternate timeline, India never lost those centuries. It faced challenges, yes, it struggled with internal conflicts, but it struggled as itself, not as a colony, not as a subject, not as a people whose destiny was controlled by distant rulers who saw them as nothing more than resources to be extracted. Closing. The empire that never was. There is a question that haunts every student of history. Was it inevitable? Was European colonialism an unstoppable force? Was the subjugation of India, and with it much of the world, simply the logical outcome of technological and economic development? Or were there moments, small and easily missed, where a different decision, a different leader, a different turn of fate could have changed everything? This story suggests the latter. It suggests that history is not a machine grinding toward predetermined outcomes. It is a river with countless tributaries, and at each fork, choices are made. sometimes by great leaders, sometimes by ordinary people, sometimes by pure accident. In our world, the British East India Company was allowed a foothold. That foothold became a fortress. That fortress became an empire. And that empire, in ruling India, shaped the entire modern world. But it didn't have to be that way. India could have said no, could have modernized on its own terms, could have remained sovereign and become not the jewel in someone else's crown, but a crown unto itself. We will never know what that world would truly have looked like. This story is speculation, not prophecy. History does not offer do-overs. But it offers something else, the knowledge that the world we inherited was not inevitable, that the suffering inflicted by colonialism was not the price of progress, that modernity and independence were never mutually exclusive. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that the story is not over. The India of our timeline, the India that endured colonialism and emerged, bloodied but unbroken, still exists. It is still rising, still reclaiming its place in the world, still proving that civilizations, no matter how long they are suppressed, do not forget who they are. In both timelines, the truth remains. India was never just a place. It was an idea that survived conquest, that survived partition, that survived centuries of being told it was inferior, backward, in need of civilization from outside. And in the end, empires fall. They always do. The British Empire fell, the Mughals before them, the Mongols before them. Every great power that believed itself eternal is now a chapter in a history book. But civilizations endure. Perhaps that is the real lesson of this alternate history. Not that India would have been better or worse without colonialism, but that the spirit of a people, the depth of a culture, the continuity of a civilization, these things cannot be truly destroyed, only delayed. And in the end, every empire wins, until it remembers it already lost.